The morning of May 17th, 1858, dawned with such perfection that the servants of Fairfax House whispered it was a blessing from heaven itself upon Lady Beatrice Fairfax and her forthcoming marriage to Sebastian Whitmore, the Duke of Ashford. The sky stretched cloudless and blue over London, and by noon, when the wedding was to commence, sunlight poured through the ancient stained glass windows of Westminster Abbey in rivers of crimson, sapphire, and gold, painting the stone floors with pools of celestial colour that seemed to dance as the assembled guests shifted in their pews. 400 souls had gathered within those hallowed walls, representing the pinnacle of English society, peers of the realm in their formal mourning dress, political luminaries whose decisions shaped the nation, distant cousins of the royal family itself, and countless others whose presence testified to the significance of this union between two of England's oldest families. The air hung heavy with the perfume of thousands of white roses and lilies, their blooms cascading from every column and archway, transforming the ancient abbey into a garden of impossible luxury. The altar itself stood draped in white silk, embroidered with gold thread, the fabric so fine it seemed to shimmer in the filtered light, and before it waited the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, prayer book in hand, prepared to sanctify a betrothal that had been arranged before either party could walk or speak. Lady Beatrice Fairfax stood at that altar in a gown that had required 6 months of labour by London's finest seamstresses, ivory silk imported from France, and Belgian lace so delicate it appeared woven from morning mist, her chestnut hair arranged beneath a veil of Honiton lace that had belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother before her. At 28 years of age, Beatrice knew she was older than most brides, knew that society had long whispered about her unmarried state, even as they acknowledged the binding nature of her childhood betrothal, knew that this day represented not just a wedding, but a vindication of the patience she had maintained through the years of waiting for Sebastian Whitmore to deem himself ready for marriage. Her bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms trembled slightly in her gloved hands, the only outward sign of the nervousness that coiled in her stomach, though whether that nervousness stemmed from anticipation or some deeper foreboding she could not have said. Beside her stood her mother, Lady Henrietta Fairfax, resplendent in lavender silk, whose anxious eyes kept darting toward the Duke as though expecting some disaster even in this moment of triumph. In the front pew sat Captain Thomas Whitmore, the Duke's younger brother, his military uniform crisp and correct, though his face bore an expression of such misery that several guests had remarked upon it in whispers. The Gothic arches of Westminster soared overhead, creating simultaneously a sense of grandeur and claustrophobia, as though the weight of centuries pressed down upon all gathered there, and the magnificent acoustics meant that every whisper, every rustle of silk, every cleared throat echoed through the space with unnatural clarity. Outside the abbey, carriages lined the streets for blocks, their drivers waiting with the patience born of long service, while crowds of common Londoners pressed against the barriers erected by constables, hoping for a glimpse of what the newspapers had proclaimed the wedding of the season, the marriage that would unite the Fairfax fortune with the Ashford title in an alliance both families had anticipated for nearly 3 decades. Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, stood at the altar in formal black mourning dress that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair swept back from features that poets had compared to classical marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, his grey eyes fixed not on his bride but on some point in the middle distance, his jaw tight with attention that Beatrice had noticed the moment she reached his side. He was 32 years old, had inherited his title at the age of 26 upon his father's death, and had spent the 6 years since managing the vast Ashford estates with a precision and dedication that won him respect even from those who found his manner cold. Beatrice had known him all her life, had been bound to him by contract since before either could remember, yet in many ways he remained a stranger, their interactions always formal, always chaperoned, always constrained by the expectations of their respective positions. She had told herself that affection would grow after marriage, that the years ahead would allow them to discover each other beyond the masks of duty they both wore, had even allowed herself to imagine that perhaps something deeper might bloom between them. Now, standing beside him as the Archbishop prepared to begin the ceremony, she felt the coldness radiating from him like a physical force, and wondered if she had been fooling herself all along. The assembled guests had finally settled into expectant silence, fans stilled, whispers quieted, all eyes fixed upon the tableau at the altar, when Sebastian moved with sudden decisive purpose that shattered the moment's sanctity. From within his coat he withdrew a rolled parchment, the betrothal contract that had been signed by their fathers 26 years earlier, the document that had governed both their lives since infancy, and held it aloft where all could see, his hand steady as stone, despite the magnitude of what was about to occur. The Archbishop's eyes widened in confusion. Lady Henrietta gasped audibly, and Beatrice felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs in a rhythm of pure dread as Sebastian's fingers found the edge of that precious parchment and began to tear. The sound of ripping paper echoed through Westminster Abbey like a thunderclap, each methodical tear, precise and deliberate, Sebastian's face betraying no emotion as he reduced the contract to strips and let them fall like snow upon the white silk that draped the altar. 400 people sat frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing, as the Duke of Ashford destroyed the legal foundation of the marriage that was to have taken place. Beatrice could not move, could not breathe, could only watch as her entire future disintegrated before her eyes, her fingers tightening on her bouquet until the thorns of the roses pierced through her gloves and drew blood that spotted the white silk like accusatory crimson tears. When the last piece of parchment had fallen, Sebastian finally turned to face her, though his eyes still refused to meet hers, sliding instead to a point just past her shoulder, and his voice when he spoke carried through the vaulted space with the aristocratic precision of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I cannot in good conscience bind myself to a woman whose affections are directed elsewhere," he declared, each word falling like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the congregation. "This betrothal, arranged since our childhoods, was built on a foundation I believed to be mutual respect, and perhaps in time affection. I have discovered I was mistaken." The words seemed to come from very far away to Beatrice, who felt as though she were drowning, sinking beneath dark water while the world above continued without her. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely audible even in that space designed to carry sound. "If you would permit me to explain." Sebastian cut her off with a gesture, still refusing to look directly at her, his profile sharp as a blade against the colored light streaming through the windows behind them. "The evidence speaks plainly enough, Lady Beatrice," he said, and she could hear something beneath the cold control of his voice, some tremor of emotion he was fighting to suppress. "I release you from all obligations. May you find happiness where your heart truly lies." Then he turned on his heel with military precision and began to walk down the long aisle toward the abbey doors, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence, 400 pairs of eyes tracking his progress in disbelief. The spell broke as he reached the midpoint of the aisle, and suddenly the abbey erupted in chaos, voices rising in a cacophony of shock and speculation and barely concealed delight at such unprecedented scandal. Lady Henrietta swayed, and would have fallen had not the Countess of Pembroke caught her, though even as that lady supported her, she was whispering urgently to her daughter about the disaster unfolding before them. Captain Thomas Whitmore had risen from his pew, his face stricken with an expression of guilt and horror that would have told a careful observer everything they needed to know about his role in this catastrophe, but no one was watching Thomas. The Archbishop fumbled with his prayer book, dropping it entirely, the thud of its impact on the stone floor punctuating the moment. Whispers raced through the congregation like wildfire, fragments of speculation and gossip that would within hours spread through every drawing-room in London. "The Whitmore scandal continues," someone hissed, and another voice replied, "First his father's gambling debts, now this." "Poor Lady Beatrice," murmured a third voice with the particular satisfaction of those who delight in others' misfortunes, jilted at Westminster itself. Beatrice stood motionless at the altar, her world collapsing around her, while the physical world remained stubbornly intact, the flowers still blooming, the light still streaming through ancient glass, her heart still beating though she wished desperately that it would stop. Blood from the rose thorns had begun to seep through her gloves in earnest now, small red flowers blooming on white silk, and somewhere in the chaos of her mind she thought how appropriate it was that her wedding day should involve her own blood. She would not cry, she told herself fiercely, would not give these 400 witnesses the satisfaction of seeing her break, would not collapse as her mother had done. Instead, she lifted her chin with the same defiant dignity that had sustained her through 28 years of society's subtle cruelties and less subtle dismissals, and stood tall as a queen before her executioners. Sebastian had reached the Abbey doors now, had passed through them into the London sunlight without a backward glance, leaving behind him a bride abandoned at the altar and a scandal that would echo through society for years to come. The crowd outside erupted in confused noise as the Duke appeared alone, climbing into his waiting carriage and departing at speed, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones in their haste. Inside Westminster Abbey, Beatrice Fairfax remained standing at the altar in her wedding gown, surrounded by the ruins of her reputation and the ghost of her future, her bouquet of white roses staining her gloves with blood, while 400 witnesses whispered and stared and committed every detail to memory so they might share this delicious scandal over tea for months to come. The scent of lilies had become cloying, suffocating, and the pools of coloured light on the floor seemed to mock her with their beauty. This was how it ended, then, she thought with a strange detachment born of shock. Not with vows and joy and the beginning of a new life, but with torn parchment and public humiliation and the certain knowledge that she would from this moment forward be defined by this disaster, would be forever the woman rejected by the Duke of Ashford at Westminster Abbey itself, the bride who was not good enough, whose affections had been elsewhere though she herself had not known it. The Archbishop approached her hesitantly, clearly uncertain what protocol governed such an unprecedented situation. But Beatrice did not wait for his counsel. She turned from the altar with her head held high, placed the bloodied bouquet carefully on the white silk draping where moments before her betrothal contract had been destroyed, and began the long walk back down the aisle she had so recently traversed in hope. The crowd parted before her as though she carried plague, and she could feel their eyes upon her like physical weights, could hear the whispers following in her wake, could sense the mixture of pity and gleeful scandal that her ruin had inspired. But she did not falter, did not stumble, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, and when she finally emerged into the London sunlight, she climbed into her carriage with the same dignity she had brought to the altar, and only when the door had closed and the carriage had begun to move did she finally allow herself to close her eyes against the tears that would no longer be contained. 3 days after the disaster at Westminster Abbey, Fairfax House had taken on the atmosphere of a tomb, its windows shuttered against the curious stares of passers-by who slowed their carriages hoping for a glimpse of the ruined bride, its doors firmly closed against the flood of visitors who called ostensibly to offer sympathy but truly to satisfy their appetite for scandal. Lady Beatrice Fairfax had not left her rooms since returning from the Abbey, had refused all callers with a firmness that bordered on rudeness, and had taken to wearing black as though mourning a death, which in a sense she was, the death of her future, her reputation, and whatever foolish hope she had harboured that Sebastian Whitmore might have cared for her beyond the obligations of their arranged betrothal. The morning room where she now sat had once been her favorite space in the house, its tall windows facing the garden, its walls papered in a cheerful yellow that caught the morning light. But now the curtains were drawn halfway, as though the room itself could not bear to face the world fully, and the trunks containing her wedding trousseau stood in the corner like silent accusers, packed with gowns and linens she would never use, a future that would never unfold. Rain had begun that morning, a light pattering against the windows that matched the grey desolation of her mood, and somewhere in the house servants whispered in hallways, their voices carrying just enough for her to know she was being discussed, but not enough to discern the words. On a side table near her chair sat a silver tray piled with unopened letters, expressions of sympathy from acquaintances she could not bear to face, and beside them lay a newspaper whose headline she could see even from across the room in bold, merciless print. Westminster wedding becomes Westminster scandal. A clock on the mantel ticked with aggressive loudness in the silence, each second a small eternity, and Beatrice sat in a straight-backed chair with the rigid posture of one who dared not relax lest she shatter entirely. Her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in an expression of cold dignity that concealed the chaos within. Her mother, Lady Henrietta Fairfax, hovered anxiously in the doorway, having recovered from her faint at the Abbey, but not from the social catastrophe that had befallen their family, torn between the dictates of propriety and a mother's desperate hope that somehow this nightmare might still be salvaged. The household had fallen into an uneasy routine of grief and whispered speculation when, on the afternoon of the third day, that routine was shattered by the arrival of Captain Thomas Whitmore, who appeared at the front door demanding to see Lady Beatrice with an urgency that bordered on violence. The butler, trained in the art of polite refusal, informed the captain that Lady Beatrice was not receiving visitors, to which Thomas replied that he was not a visitor, but the cause of her ruin, and would not be turned away, his voice rising loud enough that Beatrice heard it from her morning-room sanctuary. She sent word through her maid that she would not see him, could not bear to see anyone connected to the Whitmore family, could not face the brother of the man who had destroyed her so publicly and completely. But Thomas refused to leave, took up a position in the entrance hall, and declared he would remain there until she granted him audience. Propriety be damned. For nearly an hour he waited while Beatrice wrestled with her decision, part of her wanting to hear what explanation he might offer, part of her wanting nothing more than to maintain her isolation from a world that had proven so cruel. But finally, curiosity and a spark of her old spirit won out, and she sent word that she would see him for 10 minutes and no more. Thomas entered the morning room like a man facing execution, his usually immaculate military bearing replaced by an agitation that expressed itself in every jerky movement, and the moment the door closed behind him, he began to pace the room with frenetic energy, running his hands through his dark hair repeatedly until it stood in wild disarray. Beatrice remained seated, her posture unchanged, watching him with eyes that had gone cold as winter stone, and did not offer him the courtesy of greeting or invitation to sit. Lady Henrietta positioned herself just outside the door, leaving it slightly ajar in a nod to propriety, while clearly intending to listen to every word spoken, her presence a reminder that even in ruin, certain forms must be maintained. Thomas stopped his pacing abruptly and turned to face Beatrice, his young face ravaged by guilt and sleeplessness, and began to speak in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in his haste to explain. "Beatrice, you must understand I showed Sebastian the letters to prove your innocence," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine even through her numbness. "They were about Wordsworth and Coleridge, nothing more, discussions of poetry and philosophy after father died, and I was lost, and you were kind enough to help me make sense of the romantic poets who seemed to speak to my grief. But Georgiana had already poisoned his mind, had told him I confessed to loving you, which I never did. I mean, I hold you in the highest regard, but as a brother would, as family." The words came faster now, as though he feared if he stopped, he would never find the courage to continue. She took the letters from my rooms. Beatrice, our cousin Georgiana, who has always loved Sebastian, though he never saw her as anything but family. She saw your letters to me and realized they could be twisted if one wanted to see impropriety where there was none. Beatrice listened with a stillness that was more frightening than any outburst, her face betraying nothing of the horror and fury building within her as the truth of her destruction began to emerge, piece by careful piece. "So my reputation lies in ruins because you would die for me," she said finally, her voice like ice cutting through his frantic explanations. "How very noble, Thomas!" He flinched as though she had struck him, but pressed on, dropping to his knees before her chair in a gesture of supplication that would have been theatrical had his distress not been so evident. "I went to him to defend you," he insisted, his hands gripping the arms of her chair. "I told him the letters were perfectly innocent, that you were helping me understand poetry after Father's death left me adrift and uncertain. But Sebastian's grief has made him suspicious of everyone, has turned him into someone I barely recognize, hard and cold, and seeing betrayal in every shadow." The captain's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued. "He said to me, 'A man does not seek comfort from his brothers intended, unless his intentions are less than honorable.' And I tried to explain that it was not comfort I sought, but education, that you were merely being kind to a grieving fool, but he would not hear it." "And you let him believe it?" Beatrice asked, her words precise and cutting. Thomas's face crumpled with shame, and he shook his head violently. "I tried to explain, but then I lost my temper, which I should not have done. Said something foolish about him not deserving you if he could not see your virtue plainly, if he could trust the manipulations of Georgiana over your character. He took it as confirmation, Beatrice, saw my defense of you as proof that my feelings were what she had claimed them to be. I told him I would die for you, and meant it as a brother would mean it, as anyone who knows your goodness would mean it. But in his grief and suspicion he heard it as a declaration of romantic love." The rain against the windows had intensified, creating a steady drumbeat that underscored the revelation unfolding in the morning room, and somewhere in the house a door closed with a sound like a gunshot. Beatrice sat motionless, processing the information, feeling vindication war with despair in her chest. For yes, she was innocent. Yes, she had been manipulated. Yes, this entire catastrophe was built on lies and misunderstanding. But none of that changed the essential truth that Sebastian had not trusted her enough to ask her directly, had chosen to believe the worst without granting her the courtesy of explanation or defense. "Georgiana Dashwood," she said slowly, testing the name on her tongue like poison. "Our cousin Georgiana, who used to follow Sebastian about at family gatherings like a devoted puppy, who would arrange to sit beside him at dinner, who looked at him as though he hung the moon and stars." Thomas nodded miserably. She had access to my rooms as family, knew where I kept correspondence, and selected the letters that could be read with suspicion, if one was inclined to suspicion. Your discussions of passion in Wordsworth, of the nature of love in Coleridge's verse, of the soul's longing for connection, all innocent in context, but damning when removed from it and presented to a man already wounded and wary. "And she has been visiting Sebastian at Ashford Manor," Beatrice said. "Not a question but a statement, pieces falling into terrible place." Thomas's expression confirmed it before his words did. "Daily," he admitted, offering comfort in his time of trial, as she puts it, positioning herself as the understanding friend while you are cast as the betrayer. The solicitor Sebastian sent to arrange the separation of properties mentioned it, said Lady Georgiana has been most attentive to his Grace's well-being. Beatrice felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, rage pure and clarifying after 3 days of grief and confusion. She stood abruptly, forcing Thomas to scramble backward, and crossed to the window where she stared out at the rain-soaked garden without seeing it. "So I am ruined," she said quietly, Because your cousin is a manipulative schemer, and your brother is too consumed by grief and pride to seek the truth before destroying an innocent woman. Thomas rose from his knees, his face anguished. I am leaving for India with my regiment, he said abruptly. I cannot remain here knowing what my foolish words and Georgiana's scheming have cost you. I thought I was defending you, Beatrice, but I have only made things worse, and I cannot bear to see the wreckage I have helped create. How convenient for you, Beatrice replied, without turning from the window, her voice devoid of the warmth she had once shown him. You may flee to India and adventure, while I remain here to live with the consequences of your noble defense. Thomas made a sound like a wounded animal, but did not dispute her words. I am sorry, he whispered, inadequate and true. I am so desperately sorry, Beatrice. You should be, she said, finally turning to face him, and saw that tears tracked down his young face, genuine remorse that did nothing to repair the damage done. When do you leave for India? Within the fortnight, he replied. I requested an immediate posting, could not stay here another moment knowing what I had done. Then go, she said with finality, and try in future to think before you speak, particularly when defending ladies who require no defense because they have done nothing wrong. Thomas moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Sebastian is suffering too, he said quietly. He has shut himself away at Ashford Manor, will see no one save Georgiana, who he still believes is merely being kind. He thinks he acted honorably, Beatrice, thinks he saved you from a loveless marriage to a man who could not love you properly when your heart belonged elsewhere. He is wrong, she said flatly, but that wrongness has already destroyed me, so his suffering is of little consequence. After Thomas left, escorted out by a butler whose disapproval was evident in every rigid line of his posture, Beatrice remained standing at the window, watching rain fall on the garden where she had once walked, and imagined a future that now would never come to pass. Lady Henrietta entered the room tentatively, her face alight with desperate hope. "Did you hear?" she asked. "It was all a misunderstanding. Manipulation by that dreadful Dashwood girl. Surely this can be salvaged. Surely if Sebastian knows the truth, he will." "Will what, mother?" Beatrice interrupted, her voice sharp. "Will apologize for humiliating me before 400 witnesses, will restore my reputation with a word, will erase the scandal that now defines me. Even if he learned the truth today and came on bended knee to beg forgiveness, the damage is done. I am ruined whether the ruin was just or not." "But you are innocent," Lady Henrietta protested. "The letters were innocent. Georgiana manipulated the situation. Thomas's words were misconstrued." "None of that matters," Beatrice said tiredly, suddenly feeling every one of her 28 years and 100 more besides. "What matters is what society believes, and society believes I was conducting an inappropriate correspondence with my betrothed's brother. The truth is irrelevant, mother. Reputation is all." She moved away from the window and sank back into her chair, the brief surge of clarifying rage fading back into numbness. The wedding trousseau in the corner seemed to mock her with its pristine, unused contents, gowns for a life that would never be lived, and the clock on the mantel continued its relentless ticking, counting out seconds that led nowhere but further into isolation and ruin. Outside, the rain fell harder now, and somewhere across London at his country estate, Sebastian Whitmore sat in ignorance of the truth, believing himself honourable and Beatrice false, while Georgiana Dashwood no doubt poured poison into his ears with every sympathetic visit, positioning herself as the woman who might heal his wounded heart. Beatrice closed her eyes against the injustice of it all, against the knowledge that she had been made a pawn in someone else's game, against the reality that Sebastian had chosen to believe the worst of her without even granting her the courtesy of a question, and felt something inside her that had remained stubbornly hopeful these 3 days finally break and die. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. 1 week after the disaster at Westminster Abbey, Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, sat alone in the study of Ashford Manor, surrounded by the trappings of his inherited position and feeling the weight of his title as a physical burden that pressed down upon his shoulders with suffocating force. The study was a dark, panelled room that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him, its walls hung with portraits of stern Whitmore ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movements with expressions of judgment and disappointment, and everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of the legacy he had inherited along with the dukedom, the debts his father had left behind, the responsibilities that consumed his days, the expectations that had shaped his entire existence. His father's massive oak desk still bore the evidence of financial chaos Sebastian had been working to resolve, unpaid bills and overdue accounts that spoke to years of mismanagement and excess, gambling losses and poor investments that had brought the once great Ashford estate to the brink of ruin. Rain had begun that afternoon, a spring storm that lashed the manor windows with increasing violence as evening fell, and candles guttered in the draughts that found their way through even this solidly built house, creating shadows that danced across the ancestral portraits like accusing fingers. Sebastian had retreated to Ashford Manor immediately after the scene at Westminster, had sent his solicitor to London to handle the necessary legal separations, while he himself remained in this self-imposed exile, unable to face society or even his own household staff, whose carefully neutral expressions could not quite hide their shock at what their master had done. He had convinced himself he acted with honor, had told himself repeatedly through the long days since Westminster that he had saved both himself and Beatrice from a marriage built onto false foundations, that discovering her betrayal before the vows were spoken was a mercy however painful, that walking away had been the difficult but necessary choice of a man who valued integrity above all else. Yet something in that conviction had begun to crack, small fissures appearing in his certainty as he replayed the scene at the Abbey over and over in his mind, remembering Beatrice's face as he tore the betrothal contract, the way her skin had gone pale as death, the blood from the rose thorns staining her white gloves, the dignity with which she had stood before 400 witnesses to her humiliation. He had not looked at her directly, had not been able to meet her eyes, and he told himself it was because seeing her pain would weaken his resolve. But in the dark hours of sleepless nights, he began to wonder if it was because some part of him knew even then that he was making a terrible mistake. Lady Georgiana Dashwood had been a frequent visitor to Ashford Manor since the wedding disaster, appearing daily with expressions of sympathy and understanding, assuring Sebastian that he had acted correctly if painfully, that a man of his position could not afford to be made a fool by an unfaithful woman, that in time he would see this as a fortunate escape from a marriage that would have brought him only misery. Her visits should have been a comfort, but instead left him feeling hollow and uneasy in ways he could not name, and when she spoke of Beatrice with thinly veiled contempt, suggesting that perhaps the lady had been conducting not one but multiple inappropriate correspondences, something in Sebastian recoiled, even as he told himself Georgiana was only trying to help him accept the painful truth. It was in this state of growing unease and doubt that Lady Clara Wentworth arrived at Ashford Manor on the evening of the 7th day after Westminster, sweeping into the study without waiting to be announced in the way of elderly relatives who have earned the privilege of dispensing with formality. Lady Clara was Sebastian's great-aunt, his mother's aunt, in fact, a woman of 70 years who had helped raise him after his mother's death when he was barely 10 years old, and she was the only person in his life who had never treated him with the deference due a duke, but rather with the sharp honesty due a boy she had known since infancy. She took one look at Sebastian sitting behind his father's desk, surrounded by unpaid bills and portraits of disapproving ancestors, and her expression hardened into something between pity and fury. "You inherited your father's title." "Sebastian," she said without preamble, her voice cutting through the study like a blade, "but I prayed you had not inherited his rashness to judgment." It seems my prayers went unanswered. Sebastian rose from his chair, startled by both her arrival and the anger in her tone. "Aunt Clara." "I did not expect you," he began, but she waved away his words with an impatient gesture and crossed to stand before the desk, drawing from her reticule a folded letter that she placed on the surface with the care one might use when handling something poisonous. "Read this," she commanded, "and then you will listen to what I have come to tell you, and God help you, Sebastian, for what you have done." He picked up the letter with hands that had begun to tremble, though he could not have said why, unfolded it with growing dread, and began to read the elegant feminine script that filled the page. It was a letter from Georgiana Dashwood to a friend, dated 3 days before the wedding, and as Sebastian read its contents, the study seemed to tilt around him, the portraits on the walls blurring, his breath coming short and painful in his chest. The little fool actually believes those insipid letters to Thomas are what convinced him, Georgiana had written with obvious satisfaction. Sebastian sees betrayal everywhere since his father's death, has become suspicious and withdrawn, and it required only the smallest push to turn that suspicion toward his precious Beatrice. I merely suggested to him that a woman who writes so passionately about love and longing to another man might not have her heart entirely committed to her betrothed, and his wounded pride did the rest. Thomas's dramatic declaration that he would die for her was a gift I could not have anticipated, but used most effectively. Soon enough, Sebastian will realize he needs someone who understands him, who has been faithful when others were false, and he will turn to me as he should have done years ago before his father trapped him in that ridiculous betrothal to settle gambling debts. By summer I expect to be the Duchess of Ashford, and Beatrice Fairfax will be nothing but an unfortunate memory of a scandal narrowly avoided. The letter fell from Sebastian's shaking hands onto the desk, and he stood frozen, unable to move or speak or breathe, the world contracting to a single point of horrific understanding. "Your father bound you to Beatrice Fairfax not out of wisdom or affection between families," Lady Clara said into the terrible silence, "but because he lost £40,000 to Lord Fairfax at cards and had not the means to pay. The betrothal was the settlement. Did you know that, Sebastian?" "No," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "He told me it was a strategic alliance between our families, a joining of the Ashford title with the Fairfax fortune that would benefit both houses." Lady Clara's expression was pitiless. "Your father was many things, but honest was rarely among them," she replied. "He gambled away much of the estate you have been working so hard to restore these past 6 years, made promises he could not keep, created obligations that became your burden when he died." The betrothal to Beatrice was one such obligation, a contract signed to satisfy a debt of honor when he had no money to satisfy it with coin. And knowing this, knowing that even your betrothal was tainted by his weakness, you have now proven yourself his son in the worst possible way, condemning an innocent woman without evidence, acting on wounded pride rather than reason, seeing betrayal where there was none, because you have learned from him to trust no one. The words struck Sebastian like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and he felt his carefully constructed justifications crumbling away, leaving only the raw truth of what he had done. He had destroyed Beatrice Fairfax, had humiliated her before all of London, had torn their betrothal contract to pieces and walked away from her at the altar, and it had all been based on lies, on manipulation, on the poisoned suggestions of a woman who wanted what Beatrice had, and on his own failure to simply ask, to grant the woman he was to marry the basic courtesy of hearing her side before condemning her. God, Sebastian whispered, sinking back into his chair. What have I done? What have I done? Lady Clara watched him with eyes that held both sympathy and stern judgment. You have acted rashly and cruelly, she said, and you have destroyed not only Beatrice's reputation, but any possibility of happiness for either of you, built as it might have been on the flawed foundation your father created. The question now, Sebastian, is what you intend to do about it. He looked up at her, his face ravaged with the realization of his catastrophic error. How did you come by this letter? He asked. Georgiana's maid, Lady Clara replied. A loyal girl who was troubled by what she saw her mistress doing and brought the letter to me, knowing I would ensure it reached the right hands. Georgiana does not yet know her scheming has been exposed, but she will soon enough when you confront her. I cannot, Sebastian said, rising abruptly from his chair and moving to the window where rain now lashed the glass with such force it seemed the storm meant to break through. I cannot face her, cannot face anyone, cannot. He stopped, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, and felt his stomach revolt against the knowledge of what he had done, turned away from the window, and was sick into the wastebasket beside his desk, his body rejecting the poison of his actions as violently as his mind was rejecting the man he had become. Lady Clara waited without comment until he had composed himself, then spoke with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized all her words. Being sick will not undo what you have done, she said. Hiding here at Ashford Manor will not repair the damage. You must go to her, Sebastian, must tell her the truth, must beg her forgiveness, though you have no right to expect it. But her reputation, he began, and Lady Clara cut him off with a sharp gesture. Is already destroyed by your actions at Westminster? She finished. Nothing you do now will make that worse, but failing to acknowledge your error, failing to publicly admit that you wronged her, that will make it infinitely worse for you both. Go to her. Tell her you were wrong. Accept whatever judgment she renders. It is the least you owe her after what you have done. Sebastian stood motionless for a long moment, the enormity of his task overwhelming him. Then something shifted in his expression, the paralysis of horror giving way to desperate purpose. He strode from the study, shouting for his horse to be saddled immediately, ignoring the startled servants who scrambled to obey, and within minutes he was riding out from Ashford Manor into the building storm, his face set with grim determination as rain soaked through his coat and the darkness closed around him. The ride to London was a nightmare of mud and rain and treacherous footing, the storm that had been building all day now unleashed in full fury. But Sebastian drove his horse forward with reckless urgency, heedless of the danger, thinking only of Beatrice and the terrible wrong he had done her, the innocent woman he had destroyed based on lies and his own poisoned suspicions. He reached London near midnight, the streets transformed into rivers by the torrential rain, gas lamps creating halos of light in the downpour that did little to illuminate the way, and rode directly to Grosvenor Square, where Fairfax House stood dark and shuttered against the night. He dismounted before the front entrance, his clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his head, rain streaming down his face, and approached the door with the intention of demanding immediate entry, but the butler who answered his knock was implacable in his refusal. "Her ladyship is not receiving visitors, Your Grace," the man said with a careful neutrality that could not quite hide his disapproval, "particularly not at this hour, and most particularly not you. Tell Lady Beatrice that Sebastian Whitmore begs an audience," Sebastian said, his voice hoarse from the ride and the rain. "Tell her I will wait until she grants it." The butler's expression did not change. "Her ladyship has given explicit instructions that you are not to be admitted under any circumstances," he replied. "I must ask you to leave the premises, Your Grace." "Then I will wait here," Sebastian said, and turned away from the door to take up a position in the square across from Fairfax House, in the small park at its centre, where on fine days nurses brought their charges to play, and on evenings couples strolled beneath the trees. The butler watched him for a moment as if uncertain whether to summon constables or simply close the door, then chose the latter, leaving Sebastian standing alone in the rain-soaked square, his face turned upward toward the third-floor window, where a faint light burned behind curtains. Beatrice's window he knew from the architectural drawings he had studied when planning what was to have been their shared life. The rain fell with relentless intensity, soaking through what remained of his defenses until he was shivering violently, his formal clothes plastered to his body, his boots sinking into mud that had once been manicured lawn. But he did not move, did not seek shelter, simply stood looking up at that distant window, like a penitent before a shrine. A few late-night passers-by hurried through the square with heads down against the weather, casting curious glances at the lone figure standing motionless in the storm. But Sebastian did not acknowledge them, his entire focus fixed on that third-floor window where he knew Beatrice must be, where he hoped, against hope, that she might look out and see him, might grant him the audience he so desperately needed to beg her forgiveness for the unforgivable wrong he had done her. Inside Fairfax House, Beatrice sat by her window in darkness, unable to sleep as she had been unable to sleep properly since Westminster, her mind turning over and over the revelations Thomas had brought, the knowledge that her ruin had been engineered by manipulation, and her betrothed's failure to trust her enough to ask for the truth. She had been sitting thus for hours, staring out at the rain-swept square without really seeing it, when movement below caught her attention, and she focused on the figure standing in the small park across from her house. A man alone in the storm, motionless despite the weather, his face turned upward toward her window. Recognition came slowly, disbelief warring with certainty, but there was no mistaking that tall form, those broad shoulders, the aristocratic bearing that remained evident, even soaked and shivering in the rain. Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, was standing in Grosvenor Square in the middle of the night in a torrential rainstorm, looking up at her window as though all the answers in the world might be found there. Beatrice felt a confusing mixture of emotions surge through her, vindication that he had come to her, anger that he dared to come after what he had done, and beneath both of those, an unwanted concern for his well-being as she watched him shiver in the cold rain. She did not move from her window, did not light a candle or give any sign that she had seen him, simply sat in the darkness watching the man who had destroyed her stand in the rain as though such suffering could somehow atone for the suffering he had caused. And as the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, as midnight gave way to the small hours of morning, and still Sebastian remained motionless in his vigil, Beatrice found herself wondering what could possibly have brought him to such desperate penance, and whether anything he might say could ever repair the damage his suspicion and pride had wrought. Sebastian Whitmore stood in the rain through that first endless night, through the grey dawn that brought no relief from the downpour, through the second day that unfolded with agonizing slowness, while London slowly became aware that something extraordinary was happening in Grosvenor Square. He did not move from his position in the small park across from Fairfax House, did not seek food or water or shelter, did not even shift his weight to ease the growing ache in his legs and back, simply stood with his face turned upward toward that third-floor window where occasionally the curtains twitched and he knew Beatrice was watching, though she gave no other sign of acknowledgement. The rain fell with varying intensity through those first hours, sometimes a heavy downpour that obscured vision and turned the world into a grey wall of water, sometimes lighter drizzle that was almost worse in its persistence, soaking through every layer of clothing until Sebastian's formal attire hung from his frame like weights and his boots sank deeper into mud that had once been manicured lawn. By mid-morning of the first day, servants from the neighbouring houses had begun to notice the peculiar sight of a gentleman standing motionless in the square despite the weather, and word spread through the interconnected network of household staff with the speed that only gossip can achieve leaping from kitchen to drawing room to street, until within hours half of fashionable London knew that the Duke of Ashford was maintaining some sort of vigil outside Fairfax House. Curious onlookers began to gather, at first in small numbers, servants sent to confirm the wild rumours, then members of society themselves who could not resist witnessing such an unprecedented spectacle. And by afternoon of that first day, Grosvenor Square had taken on an almost carnival atmosphere, vendors appearing with hot chestnuts and meat pies to sell to the growing crowd, ladies and gentlemen arriving in carriages to stare at the Duke, as though he were an attraction at a fair. The newspapers got wind of the story by evening and sent sketch artists to capture the scene, young men with charcoal and paper who positioned themselves to render the image of the tall aristocratic figure standing alone in the rain, his formal clothes soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his head, his face turned always toward that third-floor window with an expression of such desperate hope that even the most cynical observers felt something stir in their chests. Sebastian was aware of the gathering crowd in a distant way, could hear the whispers and speculation that surrounded him, could see from the corner of his eye the sketch artists working and the vendors hawking their wares. But none of it mattered. None of it penetrated the singular focus he maintained on Beatrice's window, on the faint glow of candlelight behind the curtains, on the hope that perhaps if he stood here long enough, suffered enough, demonstrated clearly enough the depth of his remorse, she might grant him the audience he so desperately needed to beg her forgiveness. His body began to rebel against the punishment he was inflicting upon it as the first day wore into evening, and then night. Shivering that started as occasional tremors became constant, violent shaking, his lips taking on a blue tinge that was visible even in the dim light of the gas lamps that ringed the square, his breathing growing labored and painful in his chest. But he did not move, did not acknowledge his physical distress any more than he acknowledged the crowd that watched his suffering with varying degrees of sympathy and scandal. Inside Fairfax House, Beatrice had not left her position by the window since she first spotted Sebastian in the square, had pulled a chair close to the glass and sat there hour after hour, watching the man who had destroyed her stand in the rain as though such penance could somehow atone for his sins. Her maid brought tea that grew cold untouched, urged her to eat something, to rest, to at least move away from the window. But Beatrice could not, found herself as fixed in her vigil as Sebastian was in his, watching him shiver and sway with exhaustion, while fury warred with an unwanted compassion she despised herself for feeling. "Damn you, Sebastian," she whispered to her reflection in the rain-streaked glass. "Damn you for this melodrama, for turning my ruin into a public spectacle, for standing there as though your suffering could somehow erase what you did to me." Yet even as the words left her lips, she could not look away, could not stop cataloguing the signs of his deterioration, the way his shoulders had begun to slump forward, the trembling that was now visible even from her third-floor vantage, the blue tinge spreading from his lips across his face. Lady Henrietta appeared at the door of Beatrice's room multiple times through that first day and night, her expression increasingly frantic as the scandal of the Duke's vigil spread through London with even more speed than the Westminster disaster had done. "You must do something," she pleaded with her daughter. "Either receive him or send him away, but this cannot continue. The entire city is talking about nothing else. Wagers are being placed at the gentlemen's clubs about how long he will last. The newspapers are calling it the Duke's Vigil, as though it were some romantic tale rather than an appalling public display." "Let them talk," Beatrice replied without turning from the window. "Let them wager and speculate and make their sketches. He chose to make our business public at Westminster, and now he has chosen to make his penance equally public. I will not be manipulated by his suffering. But he will die if he remains out there much longer," Lady Henrietta protested. "The rain shows no sign of stopping, and he has been standing there for nearly 24 hours without food or water or rest. Then his death will be on his own conscience, not mine. Beatrice said with a coldness that did not entirely convince even herself. The second day dawned grey and wet as the first, the rain having never ceased through the night, and Grosvenor Square filled even earlier with observers, as word of the ongoing vigil spread beyond London's fashionable circles to the general populace who came to witness what had become the most talked-about event in the city. The carnival atmosphere of the first day had given way to something more sombre, the crowd larger but quieter, a sense pervading the assembled watchers that they were witnessing something significant, a drama whose outcome would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Sebastian stood as he had stood through the night, his face still turned toward Beatrice's window, though his eyes had taken on a glassy quality that suggested he was no longer entirely present in his suffering body, his trembling now so violent that observers feared he might collapse at any moment. Yet somehow he remained upright, swaying slightly but fixed in his position like a statue slowly being eroded by the relentless rain. The newspapers of the second day carried headlines that captured the city's fascination with the unfolding drama. Duke's devotion or madness proclaimed one, Ashford maintains vigil at Lady Beatrice's door announced another, and the accompanying sketches showed Sebastian as both tragic and slightly absurd. A great man brought low by love or guilt or some combination of the two that London society could not quite pass. In drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across the city, the speculation reached fever pitch as people debated Sebastian's motives and Beatrice's responsibility, some declaring it the most romantic gesture they had ever witnessed, others condemning it as emotional manipulation of the basest sort. 3 days in the rain, one society matron declared to her companion as they observed the vigil from the comfort of their carriage. Either he loves her beyond reason, or he is attempting to force her hand through public spectacle, but which is it I cannot determine. If he dies of pneumonia, she will be blamed either way, replied her companion with the shrewd assessment of one who understood how society's judgments worked. Clever of him, actually, to transform himself from villain to victim through sheer endurance of suffering. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Lady Georgiana Dashwood made her dramatic appearance in Grosvenor Square, arriving in a carriage that scattered the crowd before it, emerging into the rain without cloak or umbrella in a gown that was immediately soaked through, her face twisted with a mixture of desperation and fury that made her nearly unrecognizable as the poised, aristocratic woman London society knew. She pushed through the crowd toward where Sebastian stood, calling his name with increasing hysteria, and when she reached him, she grabbed his arm with both hands as though to physically shake him from his vigil. "Sebastian!" she cried, her voice carrying across the square so that all assembled could hear. "Sebastian, you must stop this madness, must come away from here. She is cruel, vindictive, punishing an innocent man for errors that were not yours but mine, and I cannot bear to see you suffer so for my mistakes." For the first time in nearly 2 days, Sebastian moved, turning his head slowly to look at Georgiana with eyes that held such cold fury, the woman actually stepped back from the force of it. "You are the architect of this," he said, his voice hoarse from exposure and disuse, but still carrying the aristocratic authority that commanded attention. "You manipulated and lied and destroyed an innocent woman to satisfy your own ambitions, and you dare to call yourself innocent, to call her cruel. Remove yourself from my sight, Georgiana. I never want to see you again." The crowd had fallen completely silent, straining to hear this exchange, and Georgiana's face crumpled as she realized that her scheming had been exposed, that the whispers spreading through London for the past day were not just about the Duke's vigil, but about her role in creating the Westminster disaster. She opened her mouth as though to protest or plead, then seemed to recognize the futility of either, and fled back to her carriage, her reputation as thoroughly destroyed as Beatrice's had been, though for far more deserved reasons. Thomas Whitmore appeared in the square on the evening of the second day, having delayed his departure for India by 24 hours when he heard of Sebastian's vigil, and he approached his brother with a mixture of anger and concern warring in his young face. Sebastian did not acknowledge his approach until Thomas stood directly before him, blocking his view of Beatrice's window, and even then the Duke's eyes tried to look past him as though Thomas were merely an obstacle to be waited out. "You destroyed her, Sebastian," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "You destroyed the best woman either of us has ever known because you could not be bothered to ask for the truth, because you chose to believe Georgiana's poison over Beatrice's character. And now you stand here as though your suffering could somehow make that right." "I know," Sebastian replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Strike me, Thomas. God knows I deserve it, and far worse." "What would that accomplish?" Thomas asked, and something in his anger seemed to deflate as he really looked at his brother for the first time, saw the blue lips and the violent trembling and the glassy eyes that spoke of a man pushed far past the limits of endurance. "You are already punishing yourself more than I ever could." He paused, then added more softly, "She watches you from her window. Every hour. She will not admit it, but I saw her when I called this morning. She has not left that chair since you arrived." The words seemed to give Sebastian some measure of comfort, despite his obvious suffering, a slight relaxation in his rigid posture that suggested this knowledge made the pain worthwhile, and Thomas shook his head in something between admiration and despair before turning away to leave his brother to his self-imposed penance. The third day brought even more observers to Grosvenor Square, as London held its collective breath, waiting to see how this extraordinary drama would resolve, the crowd now so large that constables had to be called to maintain order, and the atmosphere had shifted again from somber fascination to genuine concern as it became increasingly clear that the Duke could not survive much longer in his current state. Someone from the crowd approached with an umbrella, attempting to hold it over Sebastian's head to provide at least some shelter from the relentless rain, but he refused it with a small shake of his head, would not accept even that. Small mercy, and the would-be helper retreated, looking troubled by what he had witnessed in the Duke's eyes. Beatrice had not slept more than a few minutes at a time through the 3 days of Sebastian's vigil, had barely eaten, despite her mother's increasingly frantic attempts to force food upon her, had done nothing but sit at her window, watching the man who had ruined her slowly destroy himself in what appeared to be an act of genuine remorse. Her resolve, which had been absolute when Sebastian first appeared in the square, had begun to waver as she watched him suffer, as she saw him refuse comfort and assistance, as she recognized that whatever had brought him to her door in the rain was not mere pride or manipulation, but something deeper and more desperate. She was angry at herself for caring, furious that after everything he had done to her she could still feel compassion for his suffering. Yet she could not deny the emotion that rose in her chest each time his body swayed with exhaustion, or his trembling became so violent she feared he would fall. On the third night, as darkness fell and the gas lamps were lit around the square, creating halos of light in the continuing rain, Sebastian finally reached the limits of what his body could endure, his legs giving way beneath him without warning, collapsing into the mud that had become as much his element as the rain. The crowd gasped collectively, surging forward, but it was the servants of Fairfax House who reached him first, having been positioned near the doors on Beatrice's whispered instruction an hour earlier, when she had seen his swaying become more pronounced and recognized that his collapse was imminent. "Bring him inside," she had told the butler in a voice that brooked no argument but was barely audible even in the quiet of her room. "The servants' quarters. I will not have his death on my conscience, but I am not ready to see him." As the footman lifted Sebastian's limp form from the mud, he stirred enough to murmur words that those closest could just make out, a fevered whisper that repeated over and over the name Beatrice, and the phrases, "Forgive me, and I see only you and always only you," the delirious confessions of a man whose defenses had been entirely stripped away by 3 days of rain and suffering, and the recognition of unforgivable wrong committed against someone he had destroyed through his own pride and suspicion. The crowd watched in tense silence as Sebastian was carried into Fairfax House through the servants' entrance, disappearing from view after 3 days of constant vigil, and slowly the assembled observers began to disperse, talking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed, about the Duke's suffering and Lady Beatrice's mercy in finally bringing him in from the killing rain, about whether this extraordinary penance would be enough to atone for the Westminster disaster, or whether some wrongs were simply too public and too devastating to ever truly repair. And as Grosvenor Square gradually emptied of all but the most dedicated watchers, the rain that had fallen without cease for 3 days finally began to lighten, as though even the weather recognized that one chapter of this drama had ended, and another, more uncertain one was about to begin. The servants' quarters where they brought Sebastian after his collapse were located in the uppermost floor of Fairfax House, small plain rooms that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the main residence, furnished simply with narrow beds and basic necessities, spaces meant for sleep and little else. The room where Sebastian now lay struggling against fever was particularly modest, containing only a single bed, a straight-backed chair, a small table bearing medicine bottles and a wash basin, and one narrow window through which rain continued to patter, though with less violence than the previous 3 days, as if the storm itself was finally exhausting its fury. A single candle burned on the bedside table, and a small fire crackled in the grate, both fighting against the chill that had settled into the room along with the smell of feverfew and camphor, the medicinal odors that spoke of serious illness and the battle being waged for survival. Sebastian had been carried unconscious from the mud of Grosvenor Square, his formal clothes so soaked and filthy they had to be cut from his body, revealing skin gone pale and cold to the touch, lips blue, breathing shallow and labored in a way that made the doctor summoned by Beatrice shake his head gravely as he conducted his examination. "The pneumonia is severe," the doctor had told her as she stood in the doorway of the sick room, unwilling to enter but unable to stay away. "The next day will tell whether he has the constitution to fight it off. He asks for you in his delirium, my lady. Perhaps your voice might anchor him, give him something to fight toward." Beatrice had not responded to this suggestion, had simply nodded once and retreated to her own rooms, telling herself that she had done her duty by bringing him in from the rain, that she would not sit vigil by the bedside of the man who had destroyed her, no matter how desperately ill he might be, that his survival or death was no longer her concern. Yet even as she made these declarations to herself, she found her feet carrying her back to that upper floor, found herself standing outside the door to the servants' quarters, listening to the sounds of Sebastian's fevered thrashing and the murmured words that escaped him in his delirium. For a full day she resisted the pull to enter, standing in the corridor outside or sitting in her own room trying to read or sew or do anything that might distract her from the knowledge that Sebastian lay ill barely 2 floors above her, but his delirious cries carried through the old house with terrible clarity, and finally on the evening of the 2nd day after his collapse, she could bear it no longer and climbed the stairs to the Asgardica servants' quarters with the intention of checking on his condition for purely practical reasons, to ensure he survived and thus avoid the scandal his death would create. She entered the sick room with her armor of anger firmly in place, her expression cold and her posture rigid, prepared to observe clinically and then retreat. But the sight of Sebastian in that narrow bed destroyed her careful defenses more thoroughly than any plea or argument could have done. He looked diminished in a way she had never seen him. The imposing Duke reduced to a man racked by fever, his dark hair matted with sweat, his face flushed and then pale by turns as the illness seized him, his powerful frame seeming somehow smaller beneath the plain blankets. He thrashed restlessly, his head turning from side to side, his hands clutching at the bedclothes, and from his lips poured a stream of fevered confessions that froze Beatrice in place as she realized she was hearing truths Sebastian would never have spoken in full consciousness. "Father said I must always suspect," he murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. "Trust no one. Never trust anyone. All women are unfaithful given opportunity. Guard yourself, Sebastian. Guard yourself, or you will be destroyed as I was destroyed. But I trusted her. I trusted only her. And then the letters came, and I thought. His words dissolved into incoherent sounds of distress, and then reformed into different fragments. God, I am him. I am becoming him. I swore I would never be him, but I am exactly him, suspicious and cruel and destroying everything good. The anguish in his voice was so raw that Beatrice found herself moving closer to the bed, without conscious decision, drawn by a compassion she had not known she still possessed for this man who had hurt her so terribly. Sebastian's eyes were closed, his face contorted with fever dreams, and he seemed to be arguing with someone not present, his hands raised as if warding off blows. "I am not you," he cried out suddenly, his voice stronger. "I will not be you. I will not let your poison." But the sentence went unfinished as he collapsed back against the pillows, weeping without waking, tears streaming down his flushed face, while his body shook with sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. Beatrice stood frozen, her own tears beginning to fall as she listened to this man who had always been so controlled, so perfectly composed in his aristocratic dignity, reduced to broken fragments by illness and the weight of truths he had carried in silence. She pulled the chair close to the bedside and sat, telling herself she was merely ensuring he did not injure himself in his thrashing. But when his hand reached out blindly, grasping at air, she found herself taking it in her own, feeling the burning heat of his skin against her palm. His fingers closed around hers with desperate strength, and his thrashing calmed slightly, his fevered murmuring becoming more coherent, though no less devastating. "Beatrice, I am sorry," he whispered, his eyes still closed, clearly not aware that she was actually present. "Loved you since we were 8, since that day in the garden maze when you smiled at me, and I thought I had never seen anything so beautiful in all my life. You were 6 and you were not afraid of me the way other children were, did not care that I was to be a duke someday, just asked if I wanted to play hide-and-seek among the hedges. I told myself, duty would be bearable because you would be there, that the title and the responsibilities and all of it would be worth enduring, because at the end I would have you. Only beautiful thing in all of it, only light in the darkness my father created. The betrothal was not duty to me, Beatrice. It was hope. It was the future I clung to through everything else. And then I destroyed it. Destroyed you. Destroyed us because I could not see past my father's poison, could not trust the one person who deserved my trust above all others." His voice broke entirely on the last words, and he wept again, his grip on Beatrice's hand tightening until she thought her bones might crack. But she did not pull away, could not pull away, sat frozen as these revelations poured from him in fevered confession. "You are not your father, Sebastian," she whispered, barely aware she was speaking aloud, her voice soft enough that she told herself he could not hear her in his delirium. "You are better than he ever was, stronger and kinder and more honorable at your core, but you hurt me so terribly, hurt me in ways I do not know if I can ever forgive." Through the long hours of that night, Beatrice sat by Sebastian's bedside listening to his fevered ramblings, learning things about him she had never known, despite a lifetime of acquaintance, hearing about his mother's death when he was 10, and how his father had forbidden him to cry because dukes do not show weakness, about inheriting the title at 26, and discovering the full extent of his father's debts and mismanagement, about the crushing weight of responsibility and the isolation that came with his position, about how he had looked forward to their wedding as the one bright spot in a life otherwise consumed by duty and obligation. She learned that on his deathbed, his father had told him all women are unfaithful, given opportunity, guard yourself, poisoning Sebastian's mind with suspicion just weeks before the letters from Thomas had surfaced, creating the perfect conditions for Georgiana's manipulation to take root. She heard him confess that when he saw those letters, his first instinct had been to come to her, to ask for explanation. But his father's voice in his head had told him that asking would make him weak, that a duke must act decisively on evidence, not emotion. And so he had convinced himself that tearing up the betrothal at Westminster was the honourable choice, when in truth it was the coward's choice, the easier path than risking his pride by asking if she still wanted him. "I was afraid," Sebastian murmured in a moment of terrible clarity, his fevered eyes opening but not seeing the room around him, looking at something or someone only he could perceive. "Afraid that if I asked you would tell me the truth, that you did love Thomas, that the betrothal had always been duty to you when it was everything to me, and I could not bear to hear it spoken aloud, so I convinced myself I was acting with honour, when really I was just too much a coward to face the possibility that you had never wanted me at all." The fever raged through the night and into the next day, Sebastian alternating between periods of relative calm when he slept fitfully, and violent episodes where he thrashed and cried out, reliving moments from his past, arguing with his father, begging Beatrice for forgiveness, revealing piece by piece the man beneath the ducal facade. Beatrice remained at his bedside through all of it, had a cot brought to the room so she could rest without leaving, ignored her mother's shocked protests about propriety, told the servants to bring water and clean cloths, and left her otherwise undisturbed. She sponged his forehead when the fever spiked, held his hand when he reached for her, whispered, "I am here. I am here," when he called her name in his delirium, and found that somewhere in the long hours of listening to his confessions, her anger had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of pain and understanding and reluctant compassion that she did not yet know what to do with. On the morning of the third day after his collapse, as pale dawn light began filtering through the narrow window, and the rain outside had finally diminished to nothing more than occasional drizzle, Sebastian's fever broke with a suddenness that left him weak and disoriented, but conscious for the first time since the vigil had ended. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light of the sick room, and moved around the unfamiliar space with confusion before finally settling on Beatrice. Where she sat in the chair beside his bed, her simple day dress rumpled from days of wear, her hair loosely bound and escaping its pins, her face exhausted but watchful. For a long moment Sebastian simply stared at her as though unable to believe what he was seeing, his expression cycling through disbelief and hope and fear, and when he finally spoke his voice was barely a whisper, raw from days of fevered crying. "You are real," he said, and it was not quite a question. "You are truly here." "I am here," Beatrice confirmed, her own voice carefully neutral, though her hands trembled slightly where they rested in her lap. "You have been gravely ill. The doctor said the fever would either break or—" She did not finish the sentence, did not need to. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, seeming to gather his strength, then opened them again and fixed her with a gaze that held such desperate intensity she had to resist the urge to look away. "How much did I say?" he asked quietly. "How much did you hear?" "Everything," Beatrice replied, and watched his face crumble slightly before he mastered the expression, forcing it back into something approaching the aristocratic control she knew so well. "Everything you felt about your father, about your fears, about—" She paused, then continued with deliberate precision. "About me, about how you have felt since we were children." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the faint sound of rain against the window, and Beatrice used it to gather her thoughts, to organize the words she had been rehearsing through the long hours of his illness, the things she needed to say before anything else could be addressed between them. "Do you know what you took from me, Sebastian?" she asked finally, her voice steady but weighted with pain. "Not just my reputation, though, that is ruined beyond any possibility of repair. You took my trust. You made me doubt myself. I spent 3 days after Westminster wondering if somehow I had been inappropriate with Thomas, if I had been blind to my own behavior, if the things you accused me of were true even though I knew they were not. You made me feel ashamed when I had done nothing wrong. You made me question my own judgment, my own worth, made me wonder if perhaps I was the sort of woman who could betray a man without even realizing it. Sebastian had gone very still as she spoke, his face draining of what little color the fever had left him, but Beatrice continued, needing him to understand the full scope of what he had destroyed. You humiliated me before 400 witnesses, she said, each word precise as a surgeon's cut. You made me a scandal, a cautionary tale, the woman rejected at Westminster Abbey itself. But worse than any of that, you broke something in me that I did not even know could be broken. You taught me that even someone I had known my entire life, someone bound to me by contracts older than our memories, could look at me and choose to believe the worst without even asking for the truth. How am I supposed to trust anyone ever again when the man who knew me best chose to trust lies over my character? I know, Sebastian said, his voice rough with emotion and illness. And I have no defense except that my father's poison ran deeper than I knew. He taught me to see betrayal everywhere, to trust no one, to believe that everyone wanted something from the Duke, even if they cared nothing for the man. And I proved his apt pupil. That is not good enough, Beatrice said sharply, leaning forward in her chair. Many people have terrible fathers and do not destroy innocence. Many people carry wounds from their childhood and do not inflict them on others. You chose to believe Georgiana's manipulation, chose to interpret Thomas's words in the worst possible light, chose to tear up our betrothal in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. And those choices were yours, Sebastian, not your father's. You are right, he said simply, not defending himself, not making excuses, just accepting her words with the same directness she delivered them. It is not good enough. Nothing I say will be. My father's cruelty explains my suspicions, but it does not excuse my actions. I should have come to you, should have asked you directly about the letters, should have trusted you enough to hear your explanation before condemning you. I failed you in every possible way, and I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. The quiet acceptance in his voice, the lack of defensiveness or justification, seemed to drain some of the anger from Beatrice's words, leaving behind only the raw pain that had been beneath it all along. You should have asked me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Trusted me enough to ask. I would have told you everything, Sebastian, would have shown you all my correspondence with Thomas, would have explained that I was helping him understand poetry after your father's death left him searching for meaning. But you did not give me that chance. You decided I was guilty, and you acted on that decision without ever speaking to me about it. I know, he said again, and there were tears tracking down his face now, though he made no move to wipe them away. And I will regret that failure every day of my life. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words spoken and unspoken, with the weight of destroyed futures and fragile present, until finally, Sebastian spoke again, his voice steady despite the tears. I love you, Beatrice, he said, and the simple declarative statement carried more weight than any flowery profession could have. I have loved you since we were children, since that day in the garden maze when you smiled at me and were not afraid. The betrothal was never duty to me. It was the only thing I looked forward to, the only bright spot in a life otherwise consumed by responsibilities I did not choose, and a legacy I did not want. When I thought you had betrayed that love, when I believed you cared for Thomas, I did not break because my pride was wounded, but because you were the only person I had ever trusted completely, and I thought that trust had been misplaced. But that is an explanation, not an excuse. I destroyed you because I was a coward, because asking for the truth required vulnerability. I did not have the courage to show, because it was easier to believe the worst and act on that belief than to risk hearing that you had never wanted me at all. Beatrice sat very still, absorbing these words, feeling them settle into the spaces his fevered confessions had already created, and recognized that this conscious, deliberate profession carried a different weight than the delirious murmurings she had heard over the past days. This was Sebastian choosing to make himself vulnerable, choosing to speak truths that cost him something, and she found herself unable to respond immediately, her own feelings too tangled and complex to easily express. "What do you want from me, Sebastian?" she asked finally. "What outcome are you hoping for by telling me this now?" "I want nothing," he said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Or rather, I want only what you are willing to give freely. If you can find it in yourself to forgive me, I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that forgiveness, proving that I can be the man you deserved me to be from the beginning. If you choose to walk away, to leave me to live with the consequences of my actions alone, I will accept that and disappear from your life entirely. I will not manipulate you with my suffering or use society's opinions to pressure you into any decision. Whatever you choose, I will honor it absolutely." The rain had stopped completely now, pale morning light strengthening in the narrow window, and somewhere in the house below, Beatrice could hear servants beginning their daily routines, the normal sounds of life continuing despite the extraordinary conversation taking place in this small room at the top of Fairfax House. She looked at Sebastian, truly looked at him, seeing not the Duke who had humiliated her at Westminster, or the penitent who had stood in the rain for 3 days, but the man beneath all of that, flawed and wounded, and trying desperately to find his way to something better than what his father had taught him to be. "I do not know," she said honestly, and saw him flinch slightly at the words, but accept them. "I do not know if I can forgive you, Sebastian. Do not know if what you destroyed can ever be repaired. Do not know if love is enough to overcome the damage that has been done to both of us by your actions and your father's legacy and the manipulations of others. But I know that I am tired of being angry, tired of letting what happened at Westminster define me, tired of sitting in the dark mourning a future that was never truly mine to begin with since it was arranged before I could speak." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "You say you have loved me since childhood, but I wonder if you have ever truly known me, if our betrothal allowed either of us to see the other as they actually are, rather than as duty required them to be. And I wonder if I ever truly knew you, if the man I thought I was going to marry was real, or merely a carefully constructed facade designed to meet expectations. Perhaps," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "we need to start from the beginning, to know each other as we actually are rather than as our fathers decided we should be, and then decide if there is something real enough between us to build a future on, something chosen rather than inherited." Sebastian's expression shifted, hope kindling in his eyes, though he was clearly trying to suppress it, afraid to presume too much. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. "I am saying I do not forgive you," Beatrice replied, "but I do not wish you dead either, and perhaps somewhere between those two extremes there is room for us to discover what might be possible if we chose it freely, rather than accepting what was chosen for us before we could walk." 2 weeks after Sebastian's fever broke, and he woke to find Beatrice sitting vigil at his bedside, the household at Fairfax House had settled into a routine so unusual that the servants had long since stopped commenting on it, though their eyes spoke volumes as they watched the Duke of Ashford, now recovered enough to move about but still weak from his illness, take up residence in one of the guest rooms under the pretext that propriety allowed it, since he had been gravely ill under their roof. Lady Henrietta had initially protested this arrangement with all the vigor her sense of social correctness could muster, arguing that whatever illness Sebastian had suffered did not justify the continued presence of the man who had ruined her daughter at Westminster Abbey. But Beatrice had been firm in a way her mother had never seen before, stating simply that Sebastian would remain until she decided otherwise, and that was the end of the discussion. What the servants witnessed over those 2 weeks was a series of brief formal meetings between Beatrice and Sebastian, conversations that took place in the library, where afternoon light streamed through tall windows overlooking the rain-washed garden. 2 chairs positioned at a careful angle to each other, with a small table between them bearing a tea service that invariably grew cold as they talked, forgotten in the intensity of their exchanges. Beatrice had granted Sebastian these limited audiences with specific conditions. She would ask questions, and he would answer with complete honesty. No deflection, no aristocratic evasion, no protection of his pride or reputation, and if she detected any falsehood or withholding, the conversations would end permanently. Sebastian had agreed to these terms without hesitation, and what followed was a systematic dismantling of every wall he had ever constructed around himself, every carefully maintained facade of ducal dignity. As Beatrice asked him to explain piece by piece the man he actually was beneath the title he wore, she asked about his childhood, and he told her about his mother's death when he was 10, about standing beside her grave and being told by his father that dukes do not cry, that showing emotion was weakness, that from that day forward he must be hard as stone or be destroyed by those who would exploit any vulnerability. She asked about inheriting the title at 26, and he described the overwhelming shock of discovering the true extent of his father's debts and mismanagement, the gambling losses and failed investments that had brought the estate to near ruin, the sleepless nights spent working through account books, trying to find some way to salvage what generations of Whitmores had built. She asked about his fears, and he confessed that he woke most mornings terrified he would fail, that the responsibilities entrusted to him would prove too heavy, that he would let down everyone who depended on him, that he would become his father despite every effort not to. The conversations ranged across days, each one peeling back another layer until Beatrice began to see not the Duke, who had destroyed her at Westminster, but a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control, who carried wounds that had never properly healed, who had constructed elaborate defenses to protect a core of vulnerability he had been taught to despise. One afternoon she asked him about Georgiana and watched his face darken with shame as he admitted he had been willfully blind to her machinations, had wanted to believe her concern was genuine because it felt good to be understood, to have someone who seemed to see past the title to the man beneath, even though on some level he had known her attentions were calculated. She tested him with difficult scenarios, questions designed to probe whether his professed growth was genuine or merely another performance, and when she asked what he would do if she told him she had feelings for Thomas, his answer came without hesitation. "Then I would wish you both happiness, and remove myself from your lives so you could pursue that without the shadow of my mistakes hanging over you." The honesty of these exchanges, the complete absence of defensiveness or excuse-making, slowly worked a change in Beatrice that she was almost afraid to acknowledge, a softening of the anger that had sustained her through the worst of her pain, a growing curiosity about whether the man emerging in these conversations was someone she might actually want to know independent of their complicated history. She found herself looking forward to their daily meetings, preparing questions the night before, watching Sebastian's face as he answered, cataloguing the small tells that indicated when a topic caused him particular pain, and recognizing that somewhere in this process she was falling in love with the real Sebastian, in a way she had never loved the distant formal Duke she had been betrothed to since childhood. On the evening of the 14th day after Sebastian's fever broke, as they sat in their usual positions in the library with the last light of day painting the room in shades of gold and amber, Beatrice asked him the question she had been building toward through all their previous conversations. "What do you want, Sebastian?" she said, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. "Truly want, not what you think you should want, not what duty or society or your position demands, but what you actually desire for yourself." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face as though trying to memorize every detail. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of truth that made her breath catch. "I want you to be happy," he said simply. "If that includes me, I would count myself the most fortunate man alive, would spend every day proving worthy of that fortune. If it does not, if you need me to leave your life entirely in order to find peace and contentment, then I want to know you are well, even if I never see you again. That is what I want, Beatrice. Your happiness, whatever form it takes, even if that form does not include me." The answer settled into the space between them, honest and complete, asking nothing and offering everything. And Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, a realization crystallizing that had been forming through their 2 weeks of conversations. "Our fathers sold us to each other before we could walk," she said quietly, her eyes holding his. "Your father to settle debts, mine to collect them. We never had a choice in any of it, were bound by contracts signed when we were too young to understand what was being decided for us." "No," Sebastian agreed, his voice steady. "We did not have a choice." "I release you, Sebastian," Beatrice said, leaning forward slightly, her words precise and deliberate. "From the betrothal, from any obligation, from guilt. Whatever our fathers decided is no longer binding. You are free." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, and saw the series of emotions that crossed it. Confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to something that looked like grief. And when he responded, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly costing him something. "That is more grace than I deserve." He stood slowly, his movements still careful as he continued to regain his strength, and she realized with a shock that he was preparing to leave, believed she had just released him from her life permanently, and the realization galvanized her into speech before he could take more than a step toward the door. "I am not finished," she said sharply, and he stopped mid-motion, turning back to face her with an expression of such desperate hope barely restrained that she had to look away briefly to gather her courage. "I said I release you from obligation," she continued more softly. "I did not say I wanted you to leave." Sebastian went completely still, hardly seeming to breathe, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "I do not understand." Beatrice rose from her chair and crossed to stand before him, close enough that she could see the pulse beating rapidly at his throat, could see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I want to know you," she said, the words coming faster now as though saying them quickly would make them easier. Not the Duke of Ashford, with all his titles and responsibilities and aristocratic bearing. Not the boy my father sold me to before I could speak. You, Sebastian. The man who stood in the rain for 3 days because he had wronged someone and did not know how else to express his remorse. The man who accepts blame without deflection or excuse. The man whose father broke him in ways that are only now beginning to heal. The man who answers my questions with honesty even when that honesty reflects poorly on him. She paused, gathering her courage for the next part. "And I want you to know me. Not Lady Beatrice, who was supposed to be your duty. Not the woman who was ruined at Westminster. Me. Who I actually am beneath all the expectations and obligations and scandal." "A courtship," Sebastian said slowly, as though testing the word, and she saw the disbelief in his eyes, warring with careful hope. "A genuine one," Beatrice confirmed, "where we choose each day whether to continue, where either of us can walk away without guilt or recrimination if we discover we do not suit, where if we eventually marry, it is because we want to, because we have chosen each other freely, not because we were bartered before we could speak, or because society expects it, or because our fathers decided it decades ago. She held his gaze steadily. Can you accept those terms, Sebastian? Can you court me as though we had just met? As though there were no history between us? As though every day were a new choice freely made? For a long moment, Sebastian did not respond, simply looked at her with an expression of such profound emotion that she felt tears prick at her own eyes, and when he finally moved, it was with the careful deliberation of someone handling something infinitely precious. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough, and extended his hand toward her palm, up in a gesture of offering rather than taking. "May I take your hand?" The question, the way he asked permission rather than assuming, the reverence in his voice, all of it combined to break through the last of Beatrice's carefully maintained defenses, and she placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, the slight tremor that spoke of emotion, barely controlled. "You may," she said softly, and watched his fingers close gently around hers, as though he were holding something that might shatter if gripped too tightly. They stood thus for a long moment in the library's fading light, hands clasped, years of history and pain and misunderstanding between them, and also the fragile beginning of something new, something chosen rather than inherited. And when Sebastian spoke again, his words were barely audible, but weighted with absolute sincerity. "I will try to be worthy of this," he said, "of your willingness to begin again, of your courage in choosing to know me despite everything I have done. I cannot promise I will not fail or disappoint you, cannot promise I have overcome all my father's poison, but I can promise I will try every day to be better than I was the day before, to be honest, even when honesty is difficult, to trust you even when trust feels dangerous, to choose you consciously and deliberately for as long as you will have me. Then that will be enough," Beatrice replied, and meant it. The days that followed that evening in the library unfolded with a strange mixture of formality and intimacy, as Beatrice and Sebastian began the work of actually knowing each other. They took walks in the garden, now brilliant with spring flowers after the weeks of rain, the paths still slightly damp, but the sunshine warm and encouraging, and as they walked, they talked about everything and nothing, discovering small synchronicities that delighted them both. Sebastian pointed out a hidden corner of the garden maze where he used to hide as a child when visiting Fairfax House with his parents, seeking escape from the adult conversations that bored him. And Beatrice laughed and admitted that the same corner had been her favorite reading spot, that she had spent countless hours there with books propped on her knees, imagining adventures far from the constraints of her own life. They discovered that they both preferred morning rides to evening ones. Both found the opera tedious despite society's insistence on its cultural importance. Both harbored secret fondness for Gothic novels that they would never admit to anyone else. These small discoveries built upon each other, creating a foundation of genuine compatibility that neither had expected, and Beatrice found herself thinking that perhaps their father's choice had not been entirely without merit, that perhaps there was something between them that would have emerged even without the arranged betrothal, though she was glad they were now choosing it for themselves rather than accepting it as obligation. Lady Clara Wentworth, informed of the developing courtship by Sebastian, in a letter that apparently caused the old woman to weep with relief and joy, hosted a small dinner party 6 weeks after the library conversation, inviting only the most trusted friends and family to witness Beatrice and Sebastian's first public appearance together since the Westminster disaster. Society's reaction was everything one might expect: fascination and speculation and barely concealed delight at this new development in a scandal that had already provided months of entertainment. But within the intimate circle of Lady Clara's dining room, there was only genuine warmth and hope that perhaps two people who had been so publicly broken might find a way to heal together. Thomas Whitmore sent a letter from India that arrived just before the dinner, addressed to both Beatrice and Sebastian, giving his wholehearted blessing to their courtship and admitting that he had always believed they suited each other, if only they could get past the obligations that had been imposed upon them. The letter also mentioned Georgiana, who had apparently retreated to the continent in disgrace, her reputation as thoroughly destroyed as she had attempted to destroy Beatrice's, living now in Italy on the charity of distant relatives who tolerated her presence but did not welcome it. Sebastian read this portion of the letter aloud to Beatrice, and she felt not triumph at Georgiana's fall, but a kind of weary sadness that so much damage had been done by one woman's jealousy and manipulation. Through the weeks and months that followed, Beatrice and Sebastian continued their deliberate courtship, choosing each day to continue, discovering that the choice itself was what gave their relationship its power and meaning. They argued sometimes, both having strong opinions shaped by years of independence, but they argued honestly without the defensiveness that had characterized Sebastian's earlier interactions, and found that disagreement did not threaten what they were building, but rather strengthened it by proving that they could navigate conflict without destroying each other. On a warm autumn evening, 6 months after that conversation in the library, Sebastian asked Beatrice to marry him properly, not as an obligation inherited from childhood, but as a choice freely made, kneeling before her in the garden maze in that hidden corner they had both loved as children, and offering her a ring he had designed himself, asking if she would consent to be his wife, not because their fathers had decided it, but because she wanted to. Beatrice, who had known for weeks that this question was coming and had already decided her answer, said yes with a joy that surprised her with its intensity, and they sat together in that sheltered corner, talking about the future they would build together, a future based on choice and honesty, and the daily work of loving someone well. The wedding that took place 3 months later could not have been more different from the Westminster disaster that had preceded it. They chose a small chapel near Ashford Manor, inviting only those they genuinely cared for rather than the 400 witnesses obligation would have required, and the space was filled with warm sunlight and genuine laughter, and the sense that everyone present was celebrating something real rather than performing social duty. Beatrice wore a gown she had chosen herself, simpler than the elaborate creation that had been prepared for Westminster, but infinitely more beautiful in its elegant lines and the way it made her feel comfortable and herself rather than costumed for a role. Sebastian stood at the altar watching her walk toward him, and his face throughout the ceremony showed open emotion, love and gratitude, and wonder that she had chosen him despite everything, the ducal mask he had worn for so long entirely absent. Thomas had returned from India for the occasion, and stood as Sebastian's best man, and as they waited for Beatrice to reach the altar, Sebastian whispered to his brother, "I do not deserve this, her forgiveness, her love, any of it." Thomas smiled and replied, "Perhaps not, but she is choosing to give it anyway, and that is what love is, Sebastian, not something earned, but something given freely. Try to be worthy of it going forward." When Beatrice reached the altar and took Sebastian's hand, she leaned close enough that only he could hear and asked with a small smile, "No second thoughts this time?" Sebastian's answer came without hesitation, his voice low, but absolutely certain. "Only one, that I wasted so much time we could have had. Together. I will spend the rest of our lives making it up to you. I will hold you to that," Beatrice replied. And then they were speaking their vows, the same words that would have been spoken at Westminster, but now carrying entirely different meaning, a conscious choice rather than inherited obligation. And when they kissed, the small assembly applauded with genuine joy for two people who had found their way to each other through scandal and suffering and the difficult work of choosing to begin again. The final weeks of autumn passed in a golden haze as Sebastian and Beatrice settled into married life at Ashford Manor, which Beatrice had insisted be entirely redecorated before she would consent to live there, removing every trace of the cold formality that had characterized it under the old Duke's reign and replacing it with warmth and light and comfort. Her things were unpacked in the Duchess's chambers, books she loved lining shelves that had stood empty for years, paintings she had chosen brightening walls that had held only stern ancestral portraits, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence that this was now her home by choice, not duty imposed. Through the windows of her sitting room, she could see the gardens that were being redesigned according to her specifications, and often she would catch sight of Sebastian walking there, and would leave whatever she was doing to join him, and they would walk together with fingers intertwined, talking about everything and nothing, the easy conversation of two people who had chosen each other and continued choosing each other every day. A letter from Thomas sat on the writing desk in Sebastian's study, congratulating them both on their marriage and sharing news of his posting and his own growing contentment in India. And beside it lay the household accounts that Sebastian was reviewing with Beatrice's input, the estate finally beginning to recover from the damage his father had done, everything suggesting not just resolution, but genuine new beginning. On an evening in late November, as the first snow began to fall outside and fires crackled cheerfully throughout Ashford Manor, Beatrice found Sebastian in his study and pulled him away from his paperwork to stand at the window, watching the snow transform the landscape into something clean and new. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence watching winter arrive. And Beatrice thought about how far they had travelled from that terrible day at Westminster, how much had been broken and rebuilt, how they had taken the ruins their fathers had created and constructed from them something entirely their own. This is what love is, she thought, not destiny or obligation, but daily choice, the decision to stay and work and build together, to be honest even when honesty is difficult, to choose each other consciously and deliberately over and over again. Sebastian pressed a kiss to her temple and murmured something about being grateful for second chances, and Beatrice turned in his arms to face him properly, seeing in his eyes the same wonder and gratitude she felt, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not because they had been sold to each other before they could speak, but because they had chosen each other freely, and that choice made all the difference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, and inside Ashford Manor, which had been cold and duty-bound for so long, there was warmth and light and laughter, and two people who had been broken by their fathers' legacies learning together how to heal, choosing each other every day, building a future based not on obligation, but on love freely given and gratefully received.